He says, I'm going to make an example of you. He says, not only are you going to be publicly hanged, he said, but your body is going to thereafter be given to the surgeons for dissection, public dissection and public display. So not only was his body going to be given to the surgeons, of course, which is ironic to an extreme, but all this was going to be public. He was going to be dissected publicly, and thereafter his skeleton to be displayed publicly. A great majority of the people who attend the public dissection of William Burke are women. A lot of them are middle class, well-to-do. Some of the medical students are taking an opportunity to nip forward and take a bit of skin from William Burke and take a finger and all the rest of it. So as time goes on, William Burke is a rapidly diminishing cadaver.
Good evening, Tom. How are you?
I'm very well, Simon. I'm very well. How are you today?
I'm fantastic. It's great to see you and chat to you again. I'm looking forward to this because last time we covered a case that everybody feels so familiar with it, don't they? Because it's so long ago, the movies that have been made, the books that have been written. But here we are getting your cold case take on it, which is absolutely fascinating. I'm talking, of course, about Burke and Hare back in 1828. Now, in the first episode, we covered so much, talking about the victims and them getting caught out at the end, Dr. Knox, all of these characters that you brought in. I'm interested now that they've been caught and they're in prison. What's your take on that? Because it's quite a lengthy process back then, wasn't it, of bringing them to the High Court?
It wasn't, Simon. It was a very, very quick process back then. But we, in the first episode, we covered the whole business about the shape and form of Edinburgh and the rich and the poor and the university and the demand and supply, the demand for bodies for the fabulously famous and wealthy lecturers in anatomy. And where could they get the bodies? They couldn't get them legally. And so Burke and Hare, who are just two opportunist thugs, basically, there's nothing fancy about Burke and Hare at all. They move into the gap. They see the demand and they fulfill the supply. And by picking on the waifs and strays, the flotsam and jetsam of society who are in Edinburgh seeking work and seeking a pittance of life, basically, because it was a time of desperate poverty, the like of which, frankly, we don't really understand nowadays. So anyway, we know that they were supplying these bodies, but we know that there were such bad criminals, there were such hopeless criminals that they very soon got caught. And they got caught with the death of Marjorie Campbell, who is a woman they had lured into their house. They'd subdued her with strong drink, which was their modus operandi, and then they had smothered her and sold her to Dr. Knox's agent, William Patterson. What we also heard was that there was a very good detective, a Detective Fisher, who was a sergeant major, which is a rank we don't know about in the police these days. He was a sergeant major of criminal police, and he was right on the job. And we discussed how, even looking back over all this time, almost 200 years, you could actually recognise a good detective who was on the front foot and got to grips with the thing straight away, secured the locus, secured the evidence, got back the body. We left the story with William Burke and his wife and William Hare and his wife all in jail, separated. And now we've got to find the evidence.
When you say this guy, the detective, were there detectives in those days, Tom?
No, they were called criminal police. The force was basically structured. The vast percentage of people were called night police, and they were basically night watchmen who patrolled the streets. And they also switched on and off the lamps, the street lamps, and they dealt with rubbish collection. They did a whole lot of things apart from what we now know as policing. But 80% of the force were working at nights, and the other 20% were working during the day. And there were a handful, and I mean a handful, of criminal police who were there actually to investigate crime. But you couldn't call them detectives by any shape or by any understanding or our understanding of what detectives were. But Fisher, Sergeant Major Fisher, he could have stepped right into the 21st century. If you look at the way he conducted himself on the night of Halloween 1828, the way he moved, the way he recovered the evidence, the way he secured the locus, the way he got the suspects in, there was a man who really behaved in a much more modern way than he could have done in 1828.
When you look at the case, can you see the hallmarks of what we would do today? For instance, were they interviewed under caution? Or
Yep.
did he speak to them individually? And did he take productions? Was there any... Did the courts look for real evidence as opposed to just witness evidence and allegations? Did they look at... There wouldn't be any forensics as we know it then, but there might still have been a jacket, blood-stained clothing or something of that description.
As I described in the first episode, the point about Marjorie Campbell was that if you were selling a body, then it's better to sell it naked. Because first of all, you destroyed any connection. Somebody said, oh, that was the dress that woman was wearing. So you stripped them of clothes. The other thing they were always frightened about, funnily enough, was getting accused of theft of clothing. That was a much more realistic thing to be charged with than actually the theft of a body. So Fisher did recover forensic evidence, and he recovered blood-covered straw, and he recovered Marjorie Campbell's dress, very, very brief, sort of almost like a Hessian sacking dress, which had been chucked on the floor in William Burke's house. And so lackadaisical had they been, they were all drunk, a whole lot of them, when the crime was committed, that they haven't even bothered tidying up even the most elementary of evidence. Simon, I tell you, this is a crime. It was brutal, but it was very, very simple. It was a type of crime that even you boys in the West could have solved. You really could.
You mentioned that they're all in prison now, and the 4 of them are locked up, and there's an interview process then takes place. Is this when Hare turns King's evidence, as it was at the time?
The first thing that happens is the post-mortem on Marjorie Campbell, and that's where the problem started, because there was no cause of death, and there were no marks of violence on the body. It's easy to understand that, because as we've discussed, she was smothered. She was actually overlain. So there were no marks of violence on her body. And any marks there were on her body could be explained by post-mortem injury. Because as I think I described to you, she was actually folded in two and stuffed inside an old tea chest and then carried up to the doctor's house. So none of the doctors who examined her could agree that there were any marks to suggest that she had met a violent death. Now, many of the newspapers of the day, and the newspapers played a huge role in this, some of the newspapers of the day suggested that perhaps it was because these self-same doctors were associated with Dr. Knox. Perhaps they were a wee bit reluctant to find out cause of death. But whatever the reason, there was no cause of death. So this put the Crown and the prosecution service in a really difficult position. And that's where they had to make a very hard choice. Either they lose the case altogether, or they allow William Hare and his wife to turn King's evidence. Now, this was hugely controversial, not least because all of this was public knowledge, because there was no Lord Advocate's guidelines, there was no Contempt of Court Act then, so the newspapers were running literally commentary throughout the whole investigation. And the people of Edinburgh, who were outraged by what had happened, particularly over the death of Jamie Wilson and the girl called Mary Patterson, who we've discussed before, they were local people that Burke and Hare had killed or were suspected of killing. And there was very high public feeling about these two. So Edinburgh was a tinderbox, literally, a sort of a primed bomb waiting to go off. And so the Crown were very aware of that, and they had to move quickly. So they made the decision, the Lord Advocate himself made the decision that William Hare and his wife would be able to turn King's evidence, even though they were clearly implicated in the crime. And of course, hugely controversial. You talked about interviewing the suspects. Actually, they were examined, they were judicially examined at that time by a procurator fiscal and by another lawyer, and they were given a chance to explain themselves. Quite interesting, almost like a precognition, but under oath. And because they'd all been separated, because Fisher had the presence of mind to separate them, they all came up with very different cock and bull stories. William Burke's first story was wonderful. He'd been in his house minding his own business when this stranger had arrived with this box and had said to William Burke, "Would you mend my shoes?" And Burke was a sort of a part-time, half-baked cobbler, although no evidence he was particularly good at it. But anyway, This guy said, yes, please mend my shoes. And I said, if I give you £1, will you keep this box for me? I'll come back for it tomorrow. And Burke had said, being the trusting man he was, said, yes, of course. And he'd mended his shoes. And this mysterious man, not further described, had left, leaving this box. And it was only after he'd left that Burke had looked in the box and said, oh my goodness, there's a dead body here. What are we going to do? And you'll have met people like that before who really didn't think through.
Some things never changed, Tom. That's for almost 200 years later. Tom, you mentioned there that the interviews, or if you like, the examinations that they got, would you say, having looked at this case in great detail, and I know that you have, you're probably regarded as an expert in this case, if Hare and his wife, I think it was Margaret, if they had kept quiet, do you think they would all have got off with it?
There's a possibility of that. But of course, the risk for them was that they end up in the court, in the box themselves. And the risk was then that they would be convicted. There was no loyalty between Burke and Hare. They weren't friends. They were just criminal associates. And as soon as Hare recognised that his head might be on the line, he very quickly turned against Burke. Remember that this had been, some of the earlier murders had been Hare's adventure. Hare had tracked down, Hare had seen the victim, Hare had lured the victim back, and Hare had actually killed the victim. It's Jamie Wilson. It's every suggestion that it was Hare who actually physically, powerfully overpowered Jamie Wilson. But Marjorie Campbell was Burke's enterprise. He had spotted her, he had lured her back, and he had killed her. So Hare wasn't going to take the rap for something he hadn't been involved in, even though he'd shared in the proceeds of the crime. So Hare was always going to turn. The other risk, of course, the Crown saw, and you and I have experienced this, was if you put Burke and Hare accused together in the dock and they blame each other, then the jury can become confused about what's happening. And how often have you seen that happen? If you had 4 of them, Burke and his wife and Hare and his wife, in the dock together, the chances are they would all have blamed each other, it would all become terribly confused, and the jury would have found insufficient evidence to convict anyone. And the Crown were very aware of that. And the Crown knew that if they went to trial and the trial turned out to be a farce, and if they all walked away, if nobody was held to account for it, then Edinburgh would go up in flames. And I mean, quite literally, go up in flames. So the decision was taken. It was a very, very difficult decision to take, and the press were all over it. And some of the press commentary was absolutely lurid. I mean, there was no restraint at all about presumption of innocence, quite the reverse. And through it all comes a very, very strong anti-Irish, anti-Catholic sentiment. Because, of course, both Burke and Hare were Roman Catholics. Hare's wife was also Irish Catholic. Only Helen McDougall, who was William Burke's partner, common-law wife, was Scottish. And so there was a lot of stuff in the press about these men behaved abominably, being of the Catholic persuasion, that sort of thing. Feelings were running high.
Tom, that maybe preempts this question that I was going to ask you, because I'm interested that Knox was never pursued, although it was him that instigated all of this with accepting the bodies and paying for the bodies without asking any questions or involving any authority. And also Helen McDougall, who didn't turn Crown evidence, Burke's partner, but wasn't prosecuted. What's the position with those two?
Robert Knox was to get his comeuppance later. At the moment, the focus of the mob and the focus of the justice system was on William Burke and William Hare. But as we'll hear in a few minutes, Robert Knox was to become the focus of the anger of the mob after the trial of William Burke. Helen McDougall was prosecuted. She did appear in the court, but she was discharged from the court. I'm just going to talk about the trial in a minute.
Okay.
The timescale is this, that the murder took place on Halloween, 1828, and on Christmas Eve, 1828, the trial is conducted in the High Court at Edinburgh. On Christmas Eve, there is a full bench of judges. There are 3 of the most senior judges in Scotland, and the president of the court is the Lord Justice Clerk himself. okay? The most senior, as it were, operational judge in Scotland. Prosecuting is the Lord Advocate himself, and defending William Burke is the Dean of the Faculty of Advocates. And defending Helen McDougall is none other than William Coburn, who later becomes extremely famous as the protector of the architectural heritage of Edinburgh, the Coburn Society. Coburn is one of the cleverest men. He's a polymath, he's an academic, he's one of these people who's good at everything, and he's an extremely astute lawyer as well. So it is a star cast that assembles on Christmas Eve 1828 for the trial of William Burke and Helen McDougall for the murder of Marjorie Campbell and Jamie Wilson and Mary Patterson. At first, there are 3 names on the indictment, not just one, because by this time, the police have managed to gather evidence about the death of Jamie Wilson and the voluptuous Mary Patterson, who I described to you before. They were Edinburgh people, so there was some degree of evidence. So the 3 of them were put on the indictment. And right from the start, this caused problems because it was then not unusual, but unheard of that there would be 3 different crimes placed on one indictment. And straight away, the defence objected. The Dean of the Faculty of Advocates objected and said that this could not be. These were entirely different crimes committed at different times in different places by different people, and they could not be in the same indictment. And the Lord Justice Clerk had to agree with it. And so, right at the very start, the murders of Jamie Wilson and of Mary Patterson were dropped from the indictment, and it was only for the murder of Marjorie Campbell that Burke and McDougall stood trial. So the evidence starts at 10 o'clock in the morning sharp. There's legal argument about the indictment, but the evidence really starts at 10 o'clock pretty sharp, and it goes on right through the day. And the trial lasts almost a full 24 hours. Remarkably, Simon, at that time, once the trial started, it continued. It was not interrupted. And so it seems like some sort of bizarre fairy story that this trial would take place right through Christmas Eve into Christmas morning and right through to 10 o'clock in the morning at Christmas morning. But that is exactly what happened. And of course, the court was packed with people. There were press people there. There were people coming and going. It was the legal and social event of the year, without a question of a doubt. And there were newspapers and news sheets being written as the trial was taking place. So somebody would be taking copy. They would run out of the court. They would go down to a printing press. They would produce these news sheets. They would hand them out in the streets. The court was surrounded by a mob of people, so much so that Edinburgh Police had to call in reinforcements. They had to mobilise the old honorary sort of special constables, the high constables of Edinburgh. They had to come out. They did everything but call out the army. And talk about this in a minute, because that's the last thing they wanted to do, was to call out the army. They wanted to deal with this civilly and not militarily. So the trial went on, and because it was only Marjorie Campbell that was on, the indictment was shortened. Various witnesses were not called, including Dr. Robert Knox. Knox never gave evidence, remarkably, but his agent did. And his agent, William Patterson, there's a lot of Pattersons in this story, and we shouldn't get confused. Yeah. William Patterson is the agent, and he goes into the box, and he's really one of the prime witnesses. And he's asked about the body trade, and he starts to gain confidence. He at first thinks he's maybe going to stand a chance of being prosecuted, but eventually he gains a bit of confidence, and he starts to be effusive in his comments. Oh, yes, he says, there's a body trade in Edinburgh. Of course there is. And by the way, Dr. Knox is not the only one who's purchasing bodies. Lord Justice Clerk knew that, and the Lord Justice Clerk intervenes and says, Mr. Patterson, only answer the questions you're asked. Don't go there. You know? So they want to keep this very focused. So this goes on. But of course, the star witness of all was William Hare. And he is really the witness that everybody's waiting for. And he shuffles into court and gives a very subdued evidence. And he's warned right from the very start. The Lord Justice Clerk, the judge, says to Hare, he says to Hare, you are here as a witness. He said, and if you tell the truth, you will not be prosecuted for any matter here discussed. But if you are found to be telling lies, you will be prosecuted to the full extent of the law. Really. And all this is written down in the account of the trial, and you can see this candlelit court with the Lord Justice Clerk sitting way up at his bench, looking down at this guy. And of course, the judges hated the idea that William Hare, who was the most reprehensible of creatures, was actually getting away with it and giving evidence. They didn't like it, but they had to swallow it. So William Hare, he doesn't say very much, but what he does say convicts Burke. And interestingly, Helen McDougall is found not proven. And William Coburn, who is defending, adopts a very interesting approach. He says to the jury, look, Helen McDougall was associated with William Burke. And there's no doubt about it. She's been involved in all this sordid stuff that you've heard about. It's all terrible. But he says, Helen McDougall was not in the room when poor Marjorie Campbell was killed. And therefore, you cannot prove beyond reasonable doubt that she was actually involved in the murders. There is a chance she didn't know what was going to happen. It may be a slim chance, but there's a chance she didn't know what was going to happen. And therefore, what you must do is find the case against her not proven. He never said she was not guilty. He never, ever said she was not guilty. He told the jury, look, of course she was involved in it to some part, but there's just a little bit chance she didn't know what was going on, so you must find her not proven. Very, very clever tactics. So William Burke is found guilty, and the sentence is read out. And obviously, the Lord Justice Clerk had decided what was going to happen way ahead of time. And so the sentence is read out, and it is the most damaging of judicial remarks about the conduct of William Burke being beyond the pale of desecration of human bodies, of murder, most foul, etc. He says, I'm going to make an example of you. He says, not only are you going to be publicly hanged, he said, but your body is going to thereafter be given to the surgeons for dissection, and public dissection and public display. So not only was his body going to be given to the surgeons, of course, which is ironic to an extreme, but all this was going to be public. He was going to be dissected publicly, and thereafter his skeleton to be displayed publicly. It's real medieval stuff, this. And this is all to try and assuage the temper of the crowd who were in Edinburgh at that time. And it really was reaching boiling point, and any little flash, and the city could have been literally overwhelmed by the mob of people. And by this time, of course, people were coming in from outside as well. They knew something great was happening. People coming from all over the place, people making their way through from remote places like Glasgow.
Tom, why do you think, or do you know, why there was such a furore, or why it created this emotion within the city and created this powder keg? There was other Burke and Hares, there were other murderers about, there were other pathologists who were colleagues of Dr. Knox. He wasn't the only one. There was this whole marketplace of bodies being supplied for scientific purposes. Why did Burke and Hare catch the imagination the way it did?
The body market and the fact there were other people as well as Burke and Hare only became evident after the conviction of William Burke. So this was a horrendous thing. This was about the desecration of dead bodies, murder most foul, and of course the local connection was that Jamie Wilson and Margaret Patterson, the young, voluptuous young casual prostitute in the Grassmarket, they were people a lot of people knew, and there was huge public sympathy for them.
Am I right in saying then that, Tom, that there was never any case for those other murders, for the other 15 murders or whatever it was never tried for them?
There was an attempt. What happened after the trial? Of course, William Hare had been granted immunity for the prosecution of Marjorie Campbell, but not for anything else. And so while the Crown declined to take action against William Hare, there was a private prosecution mounted by the family of Jamie Wilson against William Hare for the murder of their son. And it failed. As you and I know, in the history of the Scottish criminal justice system, there's only been one or two private prosecutions ever succeeded, and theirs did not succeed. But what I was going to say to you, Simon, was you said, why was the mood of Edinburgh so febrile? The mood of a lot of Scottish cities was febrile. They were on the point of riot for quite a long time. We don't realise or appreciate that in our lifetime, things have been fairly calm, really. But back in these days, there were riots took place regularly in a lot of major cities, both before this and after this, at the time of the Great Reform. A lot of it was to do with religion, to do with politics, it was to do a whole lot of social unrest. And the Edinburgh mob were famous for being able to rise up and cause a lot of problems almost at the snap of a finger. It was a very volatile time. So they moved very quickly. Burke had been convicted. There was an appeal, of course. The appeal was heard within days. There was no room for appeal. And his execution date was set for January 1829, the end of January 1829. And this was another flashpoint, and the police knew it. There was going to be a riot because public executions were well known for scenes of great disorder. That's why public executions were actually brought to a halt. It wasn't that they didn't want to show people getting hanged. It was because they didn't want to deal with the mob who always attended these public executions, got drunk, and then went on the rampage. So public execution was confirmed, and the police took control of the whole of the city centre, round about the Lawn Market, where the present High Court is, actually just up from St Giles, tourist area. And they took control of that early in the morning. They barricaded it off. But a crowd of around about 25,000 turned out for the execution. It was a foul morning. It was raining. It was cold. It was January. But still, 25,000 people turned out for the execution.
It strikes me, Tom, that maybe this was a precursor to association football in Edinburgh, because that's quite a good crowd at Tynecastle or Easter Road. And maybe that's why we invented those clubs. And those people could go to those stadiums instead.
Well, it's very well, of course, it was only 50 years later that these clubs were formed. You're absolutely right. It was in living memory. But interestingly, talking about association football, was that a lot of people who attended the execution of William Burke actually paid for their tickets, because the people who lived in the houses nearby recognised a commercial opportunity and rented out their top floor windows for people to overlook the execution. So come the time, the 8 o'clock in the morning, William Burke's brought out. There's immediately a surge in the crowd. They surge forward to try and get a look at this guy. And they're shouting, "Where's Hare? Where's Hare? Where's Robert Knox?" So there's a real bloodlust in the crowd. They literally want their pound of flesh from William Burke. But the police are wise to it, very, very quickly get Burke onto the scaffold. And without further ado, in a few minutes, Burke is hanged and he's dead in a few minutes. But then the real trouble starts, because the crowd surges forward again, trying to seize the body. And what they want to do is get some sort of memento from the clothes or the person of William Burke. This is a medieval scene, and the police have great difficulty in fighting back the crowd to allow the medical attendees to remove the body of William Burke. But as they're doing so, the medics who are attending the body of William Burke, they're taking souvenirs. They're taking bits of his clothes, they're taking bits of his hair, and all that sort of stuff. So eventually they get the body away and up to the university for the second act, which is going to be the public dissection of William Burke. And here we have another set-piece public disorder situation, because, of course, a mob of people go up to the university because they all want to see William Burke and they all want to see him being cut up. Literally, there's a riot within the medical dissection rooms at Edinburgh University. The police attend. The police have to take a baton charge to clear the room. And then a professor appears, a senior professor, to say, "Listen, I've got an idea." He said, "We'll do this public dissection in shifts. We'll allow in 100 people at a time, and the professor of anatomy will dissect Burke's scalp, and then somebody else will come in and another crowd will come in and they'll see his entrails being taken out and all this sort of stuff." So that's what they do. A great majority of the people who attend the public dissection of William Burke are women. A lot of them are middle-class, well-to-do Edinburgh women who want to be part of this spectacle. And as this is going on, some of the medical students are taking an opportunity to nip forward and take a bit of skin from William Burke and take a finger and all the rest of it. So as time goes on, William Burke is a rapidly diminishing cadaver. It's an incredible dramatic sort of scene to think of this. So eventually, after another full 12 to 14 hours, they've more or less done everything they want to do with William Burke. And of course, one of the interesting things they do is they're desperate to examine his brain and his skull, because there is a theory at that time, the theory of phrenology. And now phrenology more or less says that all parts of the human body are unique, etc. But what it also says, and the theory was then, that the criminal brain is different from anybody else's brain. And you can tell by looking at the brain, and you can tell by examining the shape of the skull, that this person is criminal. And the people went to incredible lengths, collected specimens, hundreds of specimens of human skulls, so that they could do comparisons to see whether they could detect the shape of the criminal head. So this was the big thing. And who better to do it on than William Burke, one of the most famous criminals. So Burke is now out of the way, but the mob are not assuaged at all. And their attentions then turn to William Hare. Where's William Hare? And William Hare is kept in custody. There's a private prosecution attempted against him. That fails. So at the beginning of February, the prison authorities in Edinburgh say, we've got to get rid of William Hare, because as long as he is here, there's going to be a riot. And so William Hare is driven to the outskirts of the town in the dark, and then he's put on a stagecoach heading south. Of course, everybody knows what William Hare looks like, because while there's no photography at that time, in every newspaper for weeks and months before, there's been sketches, quite accurate sketches of what Hare looks like. So everybody recognises Hare. People on the stagecoach know it's him. It's quite interesting. He goes down various towns. He arrives at the town of Moffat, just before the English border, and he's given some money to go to get some rest in a pub. And a mob appears from nowhere with the fiery torches, wanting to lynch William Hare. So again, the police take him into protective custody, and they take him down to the English border, and they shoo him across the English border, and he's last seen walking south. And nobody really knows what happened to William Hare thereafter. But the women are also a problem, because particularly Margaret Hare, she decides to go back to, they're separate by this time, she decides to go back to Ireland, where she comes from. So she is taken through the West, but everywhere she goes, people recognise her. And the Glasgow police have to intercede to prevent the mob tearing her apart. And the Glasgow police actually take her to a boat, to a ferry, to put her on the ferry to Ireland to get rid of her. So the principals have all gone, they've all left Edinburgh. The mood is still extremely febrile. And of course, now it turns to Robert Knox, because Burke and Hare have gone, their wives are gone. What about Robert Knox? And the mob turns against Robert Knox. And right up until middle to late February, there are a series of disturbances and riots in Edinburgh where the house and the surgery of Robert Knox are attacked by mobs of people, sometimes up to 200 strong. And the Edinburgh police successfully fight them off, but it's with great difficulty that they do. Funnily enough, it's at this stage that the decent public of Edinburgh and the newspapers start actually to appreciate the new police service. And they actually write that we've had our doubts about this new policing system. We never thought they would step up to the mark, but actually they've done very well. And there was one night in particular in late February, which was the showdown, where there were two riots fought back by Edinburgh police. Not just did they win the fight, but they also made substantial numbers of arrests, who of course went to the court the next day and got severe punishment. So there was a real feeling that the police had done a good job, and that they'd held the line, and that they had not turned and run, which everybody expected them to do.
There would be little experience of that kind of mob behaviour which had ruled up until then. And the Edinburgh police were quite a new innovation at that point. They were only 20 years or so old. So I don't think that was just for Edinburgh police, Tom. I think that was for policing in a much, much broader scale. It maybe gave us some credibility with the public that we were going to stand up. The thin blue line was maybe invented right then.
Certainly, in terms of Edinburgh, there's no doubt at all that the trial of William Burke and the riots that followed was a turning point. because it was the first time where there'd been these disturbances where the civil police had managed to hold the line and to do their duty. Before that time, they'd always had to call in the army. And of course, the trouble was, once you called in the army, was getting rid of the army. And the civil authorities did not want, above all, they did not want to call out the army. There'd been I think I told you before, there'd been a tremendous disaster at St. Peter's Field in Manchester in 1819, where 40-odd people had been killed when the dragoons had charged into the crowd. The question was, we've got this fancy new policing system. Can it do the job? And it had done the job. And there was no experience in crowd control, but the superintendent of police in Edinburgh at that time was an ex-military captain. And he obviously knew a little bit about confronting crowds and mobs and things like that. And he himself showed tremendous personal courage in leading his men in two absolutely bloody encounters, because at that time, Simon, there was no tar macadam, so the roads were paved with rocks. You can imagine the stone throwing, and quite a few police officers were seriously injured during the riots following Burke's execution, but they held the line. And it's funny because at that time, and I suppose to some extent different now with social media, but at that time, there was a great habit of children to make up rhymes about topical events. And sort of street urchins would sing these rhymes, and quite often they got to the very heart of the matter. And the famous one at that time was, up the close and down the stair, Button Ben with Burke and Hare. Burke's the butcher, Hare's the thief, Knox the boy who buys the beef. Now, actually, if you were to encapsulate the case of Burke and Hare in 5 lines, that would be about right.
The police summary.
Summary. But at the end of the day, the case of Burke and Hare does a number of things. First of all, you mentioned, there's no doubt about it, William Hare, he gave various statements afterwards about how many murders there were. Some say there were 15. Some say there were 20. The truth of the matter is they were usually drunk. They couldn't remember how many there'd been. They needed £10 a week to keep themselves in drink and opiates. A body brought them £10. So it's not unreasonable to suppose that Burke and Hare killed 50 in their year of terror, because they knew each other only for a year. We know that. So that's the parameter of the crime. We think that probably they killed up to 50. But as you mentioned, Robert Knox was not the only surgeon in business. He was not the only person buying bodies. And it might be that over that period, we might be talking about 300 or 400 people went to the surgeon's table under what we describe now as suspicious circumstances. We'll never know. We'll never know, because life was cheap. And there's one accurate survey done in 1841 of street sex workers in Edinburgh. And it was reckoned that there were 800 street sex workers working in Edinburgh at that time. Thousands in Glasgow, by the way, absolutely thousands in Glasgow. But seriously, what they measured was and calculated was that a third of these women died every year. So there was between 250 and 300 sex workers died every year from disease, tuberculosis, from alcohol, from suicide, and some of them murder as well. Life was incredibly cheap, so nobody will ever know how many people were dissected by surgeons.
We could find out the average lifespan in those days, Tom, but even child mortality, most babies wouldn't make it at that time. It would be everything was different. You touched on it right at the start of this evening when you said we can't even imagine the social situation, the poverty, and the way people led their lives. There was no benefit system. There was no safety net for people. There was no health service. It was a different world entirely that these people were living in. And as you say, people could disappear and there'd be no trace.
This was a hugely important case for a number of reasons. One, it brought to the public attention the extent of urban squalor, the conditions in which these people were living. A few years later, when Queen Victoria came to the throne in 1832, started the huge Victorian reforms of public health and of the demolition of slums. It also brought to the attention the dependency on alcohol. And I'm not talking about the kind of alcohol that we would drink. I'm talking about firewater. I'm talking about alcohols homemade of all sorts of strengths. And again, a few years later, come in the licensing acts and actually definitions of what whiskey should be. It should be 40%, etc., etc. It also brought to attention this rancid anti-Irish, anti-Catholic sentiment that was abroad in Scotland. And some may say it still is. Some may say it still is in certain parts of the country. It tested the Scottish justice system, and the Scottish justice system showed that it could cope with these extraordinary events, albeit with great difficulty, but it did. It tested the new policing system. We've spoken about that. It proved the concept of the new policing system. And as importantly, it brought in the Anatomy Act of 1840, which brought the powerful medical profession under some control. After the trial, there was obviously some concern in very high places, the Lord Advocate, etc., that actually with the crimes of Burke and Hare, we were seeing the tip of the iceberg and that regulation was required. And the Anatomy Act of 1840 controls the way that the medical profession deal with the bodies of the deceased, and it still does. The Anatomy Act of 1840 is still the guiding statute which controls the way that the medical profession deal with the remains of the dead. And it's a very powerful, very prescriptive act. All of these revelations happened because of two drunken Irishmen who had a plan to make a few quid. I suppose if you were to sum it up and say, if you were to say to William Burke and William Hare that they, by their actions, brought about enormous social reform, I think it would be the last thing they would ever imagine.
Tom, it's brilliant. If you go to Edinburgh University now, which I did last year, and you can see the skeleton of Burke hanging in his glass cage, and they're very, very strict about any photography or about anything like that in there. The masks are there, the face masks that were taken in prison. It's a great place for a visit, and it's open to the public, although you have to book to get in, and it's very busy. Then it's very well worth a visit. Yeah. Tom, that's fantastic. Can I just ask you, because of some of the information you were giving us there, I want to stress that on Crime Time Inc., we don't deal in fiction at all. And you've many times stated that we don't need to because the facts are much more interesting than fiction ever could be. Can you cite some of your sources for the court case and for the interview, for that kind of thing for our listeners, so that they get an idea of where this information is available?
The great thing about the Scottish legal system is they are fastidious collectors of the records. And so I was able to get access to the complete transcript of the trial of William Burke. And I mean the complete word-for-word transcript. Everything that was said in that court, arising from and everything leading to the court proceedings. I had access to all of that. And as you've just said, Edinburgh University have extensive records, and indeed more than records. They have the skeleton of William Burke, which they guard very jealously. In fact, only last year, it was allowed to leave the university for the first time since 1829, and it went up to the National Museum of Scotland for a special exhibition. And the Professor of Anatomy at Edinburgh University, as well as being the Professor of Anatomy, has a separate title, quite distinct, as the Keeper of Burke's Skeleton. Now, imagine introducing yourself. Hello, I'm the Keeper of Burke's Skeleton. All of my research comes from publicly accessible data. What's interesting is that all the myth and fairy stories about Burke and Hare, they're all quite easily researchable, and yet they still prevail. It's not that I found a cache of secret documents. It's all there. You just need to read it and interpret it. I think that the real story behind William Burke and William Hare and what actually happened over the year 1828 and 1829 is much more interesting and much more compelling than some fairy story about body snatchers, which is just nonsense.
And you don't have to be the former retired Deputy Chief Constable of Holiday and Borders Police to access this information, just to make that perfectly clear.
All you need is a library ticket.
Fantastic. We'll speak soon, Tom. Really enjoyed that. Thanks for doing that for us.
The story of Burke and Hare, the story that I've just been speaking about, will appear in my new book of collected stories, which will be coming out later this year.
Next time on Crime Time Inc.
But they said that this child had last been seen in the company of a known paedophile. Again, I arrived. This little boy had been reported missing by his mother, and a search revealed the wee soul was dead. Spent the entire night painstakingly photographing, videoing the scene while they recovered Mark's remains. There was a police cordon around the place. They knew from CCTV who he was. He was nowhere to be found. And then during the course of the evening, he turned up at the cordon with a pizza, asking for access to his house. And the cops asked him what his name was, and he said Stuart Leggett.